Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So I know that it's been a little bit of time since I last had a video. The last video I had was the network inventory, and hopefully, within that time you've learned a bit more about the network automation space. I know that what I'd like to say is that one thing we did not cover yet is classes. Okay, so I know that a lot of the network engineers that I know that are transitioning to code, typically they don't have a lot of experience outside of writing a function and the variables and the basics of Python in essence. I wouldn't necessarily classify classes as something that's necessarily advanced, but it's definitely something that takes a little bit of work to get an understanding of. So what I wanted to do is show you guys a little bit about what a class is, about all the different pieces that contribute into a class, and then some of the cool little things you can do with the class. Me personally, when I started out, as you saw, I did more of things in a function-based manner. But with a class, it's nice because just think of a class, like I said, as an object. That's really what a class is. It is an object with a set of attributes, and alongside that, you also have a set of methods. Okay, so I want you to think of something, for example, just think of a class like network device. Okay, that could be our class. And each network device has an IP address, and it has a username, and it has a password, and it has a port number to be accessed, for its management plane. And then you'd have various methods under that specific base device, okay? And these methods would be specific to a generic network device, right? So an example of that could be connect to device or disconnect from device, all right? Now, the thing is, there's a lot of variance in what it is that network device could be, because it could be a router, it could be a switch, it could be a VPN, it could be a firewall, it could be a proxy, however you may classify that, right? So when you think about a class, you think about, you model it based on what you know about a device, based on its properties, based on what you would usually do with the device or what you wouldn't do with the device, and then you would go from there, breaking it down, okay? So let's think about this for a second. Something you could have is something called a child object, right? A child class. And the child class would inherit this base network device class. And then there would be more specific attributes to that specific network device. So let's say it's a router, right? What does a router have that's more distinguishable than just saying a generic network device? Well, obviously, that maybe there's some routing licenses that you have on the routing device that you wouldn't have on a generic network device, right? Or maybe on a chassis, okay? Maybe it's a chassis device, although I don't think I would put that as a class. Maybe, for example, let's say with the firewall, maybe you're looking to identify the vendor of the firewall, or maybe you're looking to identify some other piece of metadata that's specific to that firewall, but not necessarily specific to network devices in general, okay? So I think that covers it a little bit. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a little bit of code so you can kind of get a understanding, based on the explanation I just made. So we start with just saying class, okay, and then you make the name of the class. We'll just say network device. Okay, that's what we'll call it. We'll call it network device. And then there's this thing under every class that you have to define. Okay, so I told you that under each class you have a set of methods, all right? So a method is synonymous with a function. It's the same thing, but the difference is that because it falls under a class, under a specific object, because that object has a specific set of methods, it's just a way to differentiate, what's really the same thing, just in different contexts, okay? So one method that's always required, pretty much, for any class, right, is the init function. Okay, in the init function, you're going to have this thing called self. Okay, so self is pretty much mandatory within a class whenever you initialize, and pretty much whenever you define a method, you're always going to have the first argument as self. The self is always required. Okay, and then you're going to define your set of attributes. So, you know, what did I say before? I said IP address, and then I said username, and then I said password, and then let's say that there's a port number. And oh, this is another thing. Keyword argument, okay? We're gonna set that as a default of 22. Okay? And then after we do that, actually one thing I wanted to mention, I don't know if you already know this, but whenever you're defining a function, okay, the first thing you want to define always is your arguments and then your keyword arguments. If you put a keyword argument in the middle of a set of arguments, it's going to throw an error. So you always start with the arguments. This is an argument, okay, and then you pass in your keyword arguments after that. So let's say I have another argument here, and let's say that argument is model, and let's say the default model is an 1841 router, and that should probably be a string. Okay, that's what I mean by keeping keyword arguments on the end of your input to your function, and then keep the arguments on the left side. All right. Now after that, what you have to do is you have to initialize each of these attributes. Okay, so you're going to say self, and then whatever the attribute is. So in this case, we have IP address. All right, and we'll call it IP address, and then we have one for username. Call it username. Same with password. And then as for the port is already defined, so we don't need to deal with that. Okay. And then let's say that we want to define a function within this specific object. Okay, then we'll just define a function here. Let's say get info. Okay, and then again, self is required, as I have always said. All right. Now let's say we're going to print. We're going to do an F string here because I love my F strings. All right, we're going to say the IP address of this device is, and then what, self.ip address. Okay, and then we'll say, and the username of the device is, and then self.username. Okay, and that will be our starting point. Okay, so now what we're going to do is what we have to do now is we have to instantiate an object. Okay, we have to instantiate is a class. We have to instantiate an object of this specific class. So we're going to say, we'll just call it R. I'll call it router actually. Let's call it router. We'll say base device. Sorry, not base device. Network device. And then within the network device, we have to define all these attributes. Okay. And we're going to say for IP address, we're going to put 192.168.1.1. We have username, so our username will be admin. And then let's say our password will be Cisco. And that's it. Okay. And then we'll say print router, and then we'll say what is our IP address. All right. Okay. Now I'm going to run that. Okay. Run objects, and this is what returns. It's returning the IP address of the device. Okay. So that's pretty straightforward. Now let's say that you want to. Let's say that you want to call the function. Okay, so we're going to say router.getInfo. Okay, since there's no arguments here. Okay, so let's run this again. Right? Let's run this again. Oh, I accidentally started this. Ignore that. And this time we're going to run here, run this, right? The IP address of this device is 192.168.1.1, and the username of that device is admin. Okay, so we know that the function works, and we know that we can call objects whenever we want to. Okay, so now let's verify to make sure that we can pass in an argument. All right, and we'll call this argument model. Right, and the model is model. Right, and then get info, and we'll call the model 1841. Okay, and what you'll notice here, is if you ask for a argument in the function, you don't need to call this self here whenever you're calling the attribute, because it's called within this method. All right, so just keep that in mind whenever you're writing these out. Just keep that in mind that you are, if it's not instantiated up here and you're passing it down to a method, you don't need to have this self thing as a prefix to whatever the variable is. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, the next thing that I want to cover, so we have this here, right? We have a port equals 22. So let's, because this is up here, but it's not instantiated, you're probably wondering, well, how does that work, right? So if I were to say, I'm gonna remove this for a second. All right, so I'm just gonna say print router dot port. Okay, and then we were to run that, you're gonna see here that there is no attribute here instantiated. Okay, it's not setting this up as we'd like it to. So if we were to put this here and just say, let's say 22, okay, it's going to show up. It's going to show up. So you want to define this down here, right? But here's the next thing. Okay, here's the next thing. So I talked about previously, basically taking this object and then inheriting it. So let's say you have a router, right? A router may have more specific attributes, okay? So the way that you do that is you're going to have another class called router, right? And we're going to inherit the network device class, okay? And again, as I told you before, we have to do an initialize, okay? And then once we do the initialize, the next thing we have to do is we have to initialize each of the attributes that we want, right? So you're going to have IP address, you're going to have username, you're going to have password, all right? And then, after you do that, notice here that this thing here is grayed out. And the reason that is because you need to include your parentheses here. Once you do that, what are we going to do? We're going to run this, okay? We set this to router, as you notice instead. We set it to a router object, right? And we're passing in the exact same attributes that came from here, right? So let's see if we get our attributes to come through. And it came through, okay? What about our port? Does our port come through? Even though it's not instantiated here? Yeah, it does. Okay. And then finally, let's test our method. Okay. Get info, right? And then we're going to pass in a model. So the model is 1841. Okay. Run this, and we get 1841. Okay? So, now that you see that, there's one other thing that I want you to observe. Okay? And this is called overriding. Alright? This is called overriding. So, there's two things you can do with overriding. You can override an attribute from a parent class, and you can also override a method, right? So if I were to say get info here, it's exactly the same, right? But instead of saying model, how about we say model and we say license? Okay. So then here, we're going to change our output, and we are going to say the model is model, and the license is license. Okay. And then we have a model. Now we just need a license. Okay, we'll just call it K9. Or we'll call it SEC, like security license. Okay. And now you will see that we have successfully overridden the other method. And you're probably wondering, when would you do this, right? And I would say that it goes back to what it is the network device from an attribute standpoint, what it possesses, right? So there's going to be some specific network devices that may have more than the IP address, the username, the password. Maybe there's some other specific attribute that comes into that. You know, let's say, for example, like Fortinet has something called a VDOM, right? Things like that could be an example of attributes that you wouldn't see necessarily from a vendor, or something along those lines. Okay? So now that we've seen that, there's one other thing that I think that we should probably cover. And that is, in essence, instances as attributes. Okay? So I want you to think of the context for this. All right? So what we did here was we have a network device, and then we went less generic and we defined a router. Okay? And the router inherits the attributes and the methods of the generic class. Okay? Well, what if you had several attributes that applied for something specific to that router? So let's say, for example, let's say a license. Okay? I already covered here. This is the class that we're going to define for our license. Okay? So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to have a couple different attributes under the license, right? We're going to have an expiration date of the license, and we're going to have something called the license name. And I had previously defined the license name here, but because we want to modify this, we're going to remove that, okay? And we are also going to delete this. Actually, no. I know what I'm going to do with that. Let's leave this alone for now. Okay. Let's leave it alone. As long as we don't call it, we'll be okay. So, what we do if we want to put it in as a set of attributes is we're going to say here, we're going to say self license equals, and then the class name, and then you want to put the parentheses after that. Okay? So, since we did that, the next thing that we have to do is we also have to pass in some variables. Okay, so in this case, our variables, we will have license name, and we will have, we'll say license expiration. Okay. And then we're going to pass those into here. We're going to say license name and license expiration. And actually, we need to flip this here too. And we have those instantiated. Okay. And what we're going to do here is we only have to change this because it's already declared. So we're going to say self.license.license name. Oh, wrong one. License name. Okay. And then we're going to come down here. We're going to say router.get info. And we shall pass in our model. Okay. Run this. And we are, oh, where'd that go? Thought I put that there already. All right, so first our license name is going to be called sec, and then our license expiration, we'll just say 1/10/2020. Okay. And we should probably use these instead. And we'll run that. The model is 1841, and the license is security. All right. So that is how you would define a instance as an attribute. Now that we have that down, we're going to finish up with a hands-on setup. And actually, most of this code is already pretty supplementary to what we're trying to do. The only thing is, I don't want to use this. I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to comment, actually, I'll leave that alone because it's not going to affect anything. I would say, I'm going to comment this out as well, since the license doesn't exist anymore. And what we're going to do is we're going to come down here, we're going to have a definition here called connect. Okay. And then you got to think about this for a second. What exactly do we need if we were to connect with NetMiko? Because that's what we're going to do. What would we need to connect with NetMiko? Firstly, we need to import NetMiko. Okay. And then we need to define the device type. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we're going to define a session here. And I'm trying to remember what all the variables are. Let's see, we have self IP address. You have the username, which is going to be self username. You're going to have password. And you're going to have device type. And this one, obviously, like I told you before, you don't need self for that. And I think that's it. I think that's the only 4 different things you need. And then let's make sure that we also create a method for disconnect. Okay, we don't really need anything for that. So we'll just say, oh, actually, that's one other thing I almost forgot to do. You're going to return, actually, you're going to set a variable here. We're going to say self connection equals X. Okay, now we're passing that attribute back into our instantiation of the class, and I'll show you what that means in a second. Okay. And one other thing, just to show you that this works properly, first here I'm going to just make sure that we do this. We're going to say if self connection, and say self connection dot disconnect. Okay. Else, we're just going to say return no connection to disconnect. Okay. And then we're going to also do something else. We're going to say here, we're going to say def get prompt. Again, we're going to say if there's a connection, all right, then self connection get prompt. I think should be a get prompt method, at least. Oh, you know what? I think it's actually find prompt, not get prompt. Yeah, there it is. Okay, and we'll just say find prompt and go with that, and then we'll say else. All right, and then what we're going to do is we are going to make sure all of our variables here are good. So let's remove these two. I actually do have a lab running, and it is 171.51. I don't care about this. What we do care about is we want to say router.connect. Okay. And we want to say router get prompt. Okay. That should be everything. All right, so let's run this. And actually, one other thing we should probably do at the end here. Let's make sure we disconnect it. Okay. Run it. And right, yeah, I need to remove these before we can instantiate that. Right. So device type is going to be Cisco iOS. Okay, well let's do this instead. Let's add something here. We'll say get output. And actually, maybe it'd be appropriate. No, we'll keep it here. We'll keep it here. Def get output self. All right, so then we're going to say if self connection again. Self connection send command. All right, and we're going to say show IP interface brief. So this is currently a router that we're connecting to. It's just a virtual IOSV router. Return. Actually, let's just do this right here. That's why I'm not returning anything. Okay. Return output. Else. Return. No connection. And that's probably why I'm also not getting this. Totally forgot about that. So instead, I'm going to say send command. Sorry, not send command, get output. Command will be, oh, yeah, you know what, this is not best practice. Instead, you want to just include a command in the get output, and then throw in our output, run this. And there's our output. So it's as simple as that. It's really as simple as that. You have the ability here to run everything from a class. And the nice thing about classes is there's a lot more sorting that's done in a very effective manner. When you have objects of any sort, when you're doing programming, object-oriented programming is always encouraged, especially when it's a large-scale program. But whenever you're programming, I highly encourage you to use something like this, to where you define different devices. And then another thing you could define as well, you could define SSH objects, you could define connection objects of sorts within your specific device. If you maybe you want to do something more specific, you know, I showed you the license name and the type of license. You could do something with that to where you run maybe an update on the license, or you remove it, or, you know, something like that. I mean, there's so many different possibilities. So hopefully this was quite informative for you. I really only use this to show you basically what you can do with a class, all right? And just remember, you know, best practice here is typically you want to have your return statements, especially whenever you're within a class. And then also make sure that your functions align with the specific object, because technically a network device, you can connect to it, you might be able to get a prompt, you know, so this is one other thing I could cover. Maybe you couldn't get a prompt from, let's say, like a Linux box, because technically, let's classify a Linux box as a network device, right? But a router, maybe the Linux box is not a router, but there are Linux boxes out there that act as routers, but let's say in this case it's not, okay? So then we're gonna throw that get prompt thing down here, and that should give us a good layout. And then let's make sure that this works like we want it to. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna say here, get prompt, okay? And this time we should actually get the prompt. All right, we're gonna run this one more time. And there's our prompt. So what did we cover here? We covered everything classes. That is most of what you need to know about a class as a network engineer. You know, getting into advanced stuff, there's other things, you know, like decorators. I don't want to get into that. That's much more advanced. This is more for a basic crowd, basic and intermediate. We might eventually delve into advanced if there's enough interest for it. But ultimately, there's one thing you may have noticed, and that is the amount of time it takes to pull from one device is very slow. Now, if we were to do this to 10 different devices, that would have taken forever. So one of the things that a lot of people, especially guys that are newer to coding, you know, network engineers that are moving over to DevOps or network automation or whatever it is, they don't have any concurrency built into their code. And what that means is that they don't run these different connections at the same time, or run them intelligently or intuitively to where the computer is making the most out of its time and also the most out of its hardware, right? So the next video that I'm going to be doing is specifically on the concept of that concurrency. And we're probably going to use this exact same example here, but instead we're going to have concurrency built in. All right, so that's going to be a little more intermediate. I don't want you to get intimidated by it, but hopefully you enjoyed this video. Like and share, subscribe if you like the video. All right, and I would like to thank you for viewing.